Just 2 days after the Senate acquitted former President Trump for his role in inciting last month's deadly attack on the U.S. Capitol, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she is working to establish a 9/11-style commission to investigate the assault. In a letter to House colleagues, Speaker Pelosi wrote the bipartisan commission would be independent and aimed at investigating the security failures of that day. This comes as CBS News has obtained access to all of the evidence submitted by the House impeachment managers. It includes 850 video and audio clips, some of which we saw during the impeachment trial. The rest was used to help the House managers build their case. In the meantime, the Department of Homeland Security says it anticipates domestic terrorists will pose an increased threat to government facilities and personnel this year. Domestic terrorism. The agency cites civil unrest, COVID-19 restrictions, and fallout from the 2020 presidential election as key drivers of that threat. For more on this, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe. He is standing by at the White House. So, Ed, the scope of this investigation, tell us about it. And with former President Trump's impeachment trial all done now, what additional evidence are lawmakers hoping to find?
Yeah, you know, Vlad, those are great questions, and we don't have definitive answers just yet. But if you look at the Speaker's letter, essentially this is designed to get at the origins of what happened on January 6th and the response to it. So if this ends up getting passed, not only with congressional approval, but also potentially subpoena power and the ability to refer individuals to the Justice Department, that's about as meaty and substantial as an independent commission can get in this town that is tasked with investigating some kind of an event. You go back to the 9/11 Commission, you look at the Iraq War Study Group that was put together earlier this century. Those are the kinds of independent commissions that usually bring together well-known Democratic and Republican luminaries to take a look at this. The difference here, of course, is that this is something that was driven by ideology, by partisanship, and there is deep disagreement about the origins of it and who exactly is to blame on Capitol Hill among the lawmakers who are going to have to ultimately decide that this kind of commission is necessary. But by putting her weight behind it, the Speaker, in essence, saying it's got to happen and that this is Congress's way, at least, to try to put a final investigation together that looks at this. And we should point out there are separate committee investigations already underway, especially over in the Senate, where they're trying to get information from Capitol Police, from the military, from Washington, D.C. officials about what happened in terms of the response to the violence and the preparations in advance.
Anne-Marie, real quick, let me just ask Ed a real quick follow-up. So, Ed, what about this letter that was sent to Speaker Pelosi from Jim Jordan and Republicans? Isn't what Speaker Pelosi essentially, isn't this establishment of this bipartisan commission what they're asking for, the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, and look, everyone understands that it's going to take some kind of, you know, body that is above the daily political fray to figure this out. So, you know, that is the best model that Washington knows. And I think, you know, where there will be squabbling initially is over, again, how significant is the investigative muscle of this group? Can they subpoena people? Can they refer people for criminal prosecution? And who exactly sits on this commission? One of the immediate complaints of those that are seeing this kind of proposal or concerns is that if you look back at the 9/11 Commission, which was nearly 20 years ago, it was predominantly male and predominantly white individuals who sat on it. Given the times we're in, given that societal norms and whatnot have moved on, obviously the composition of that commission is going to look quite different. But that was one of the early signals that people made. It's like, well, you can put something like that together, but how you define an expert, how you define somebody who is capable or qualified to serve on this kind of commission is going to be far different than it's been in the past.
So meanwhile, President Biden is pushing forward with key parts of his agenda. He's heading out west to Wisconsin tonight. What's he hoping to achieve? What's the message that he wants to send? And what's going on with that coronavirus relief package?
Well, it's all about that, getting the package through the House here in the next 10 days or so, and then on to the Senate. He's going back to Wisconsin, a state he won by only a few thousand votes, and trying to make the case for his American Rescue Plan to an audience in the Midwest in a city where he was supposed to hold the Democratic National Convention last summer, but of course it was postponed because of the pandemic. Wisconsin, a state that is feuding amongst itself, really, over things like a mask order, whether or not there should be one. The Democratic governor says there should. The Republican legislature feels otherwise. You've got a Republican senator in Ron Johnson who is strongly opposed to most of the things the president is up to and is still trying to decide whether or not he should run for re-election next year or retire. So by bringing the president to town, it adds a little muscle to that and perhaps tries to persuade Wisconsinites to call their local representatives and get them to support this legislation. Later in the week, he heads to Kalamazoo, Michigan, to a Pfizer vaccination center to tout the ongoing development and distribution of the vaccines. That comes amid bipartisan concern, especially for the nation's governors, that the distribution isn't going fast enough, and corporate leaders who say that they wish that corporate America was being leaned on a little more to help get the vaccine out there. So there will continue to be questions about that this week for the president as well.
So, Ed, as you know, the Biden administration has announced it's extending forbearance and foreclosure protections. What more can you tell us about the protections that this program provides?
Yeah, so one of the first things that the new president did when he took office was to extend the foreclosure moratorium on federally backed mortgages until the end of March. Now he's extending it through the end of June. And then those who there's also another 6 months of additional mortgage payment forbearance in 3-month increments for borrowers who entered forbearance on or before June 30th of 2020. Essentially, people who have federally backed mortgages, if they need relief and they qualify under this, they can get it for at least a few more months. These are the modest things that an administration can do on its own to give relief to millions of Americans, and it's designed to sort of demonstrate that the administration is concerned about, aware of, conscious of, trying to help millions of people who are struggling through the pandemic to make basic payments on rent, on utilities, car payments and whatnot, at a time when things are really tight for millions of Americans across the country. And of course, the weather that now millions are struggling through as well is going to complicate matters even more, with so many now out of power, with vaccination schedules being pushed back, with schools closed. It's going to make things even more difficult for millions across the country.
Ed, on the 3rd anniversary of the Parkland school shooting, President Biden called on Congress to pass stricter gun laws. We've heard this before many, many times. On the campaign trail, Mr. Biden promised to take action on guns within his first 100 days in office. I don't know if gun control is particularly a high priority right now for Congress. What is it that the president can or plans to do in regards to his promise? Is there anything he can do without waiting for Congress?
Not much, because remember, this was an issue after the shooting in Las Vegas a few years ago, where they talked about what modest executive actions could be taken by a president and federal agencies, and all they really did was sort of limit the scope of who can buy and what, bump stocks, I think is what it was exactly. So beyond that, it requires legislation. He had promised about a year ago as a candidate that on day one he would announce plans to ban assault weapons, limit the size and scope of firearm sales across the country, and it didn't come. It didn't happen. The most substantive action we've gotten from him so far on this issue is the statement he issued last night, calling on Congress to take action. But he's not providing any specific examples of what he'd like to see done just yet. And he knows that between the pandemic relief, between the immigration legislation, the ideas there that are expected to be announced in the coming days, another top priority that he's already sent to the Hill for consideration, that dealing with Second Amendment issues, guns, who can buy them, the size and scope of those firearms is an issue that's going to have to wait. Even though in recent years Democrats have found that if you run on the theory or the concept of limiting gun sales, putting in universal background checks and issues like that, you actually can now win elections that way. But given the close nature of Congress, given the fact that it is a sensitive issue in many of the swing districts across the country and the states where they're going to be competitive races next year, it seems the White House is making a political calculation as well, not only a priority calculation, with the pandemic, with immigration being seen as far more urgent priorities right now.
Right. Ed, thank you very much.
Take care.
So be sure to stream Red and Blue today. Our colleague Elaine Keano and her team will have the latest developments from Washington, including coronavirus relief talks and the investigation into the attack on the Capitol. You can stream Red and Blue starting at 5 p.m. Eastern right here on CBSN.
In North Carolina, at least 3 people are dead and 10 are hurt after a tornado tore through Brunswick